When we think of the Appalachian Mountains, it's almost automatic to imagine those breathtaking landscapes, endless trails, ancient trees, and a refuge for those seeking a connection with nature. This mountain range, which stretches for more than 1,500 miles from Canada to Alabama, is one of the oldest geological formations on the planet, with a history dating back more than 480 million years. But behind this postcard-perfect scenery, there are secrets that don't appear in tourist guides. Ancient stories, unofficial reports, and local whispers speak of something that goes far beyond wild animals, unexpected storms, or hiking accidents. Something that the forest itself seems to guard, protect, or hide. Over the decades, hundreds of disappearances have been recorded in various parts of the Appalachians, especially in the most remote regions. Cases that, most of the time, are quickly filed away as accidents, animal attacks, or simply people who got lost. But what if not all these disappearances could be explained that way? What if, in fact, there was something there, something that was never meant to be found? Welcome to another night where mysteries never sleep. I am Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for your help. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's just one click, but it makes a huge difference for YouTube to show these videos to more people, and so I can continue bringing this content to you. I'm counting on you. Let's get into the video. There are things in life that we don't choose. They simply happen, appearing in our path as if fate itself were testing us. The news of my paternal grandfather's death was one of those things. It wasn't exactly a surprise. He was already an old man, isolated, practically a living ghost in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. But what really caught me off guard was what came next. He had left me a cabin as an inheritance. Why? Why me? My relationship with him was never close. In fact, it almost didn't exist. He would show up occasionally during my childhood, rarely spoke more than a handful of words, and always left before I even realized he was there. I grew up hearing my mother say that he was a strange man, someone who chose isolation, someone who wasn't like the others. This, of course, always came with a certain resentment, especially because talking about my grandfather inevitably meant talking about my father. My father, that was another shadow in my life. He disappeared when I was just a baby. I grew up with no photo, no letter, not even the sound of his voice. My mother always avoided the subject, as if opening that door could bring something to light that she herself preferred not to face. "You're just like him," she used to say. But like him how? What did she mean by that? Adolescence was a minefield. My stepfather never tried to hide that I wasn't part of his plans. The relationship was cold, often harsh. And every time we argued, my father's name would come up, as if his absence was an open wound that would never heal. And maybe it really never did. That's why, when that letter from the lawyer arrived, informing me about the cabin, something inside me lit up. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It seemed, in a way, like an opportunity, a definitive break from that broken past, a space of my own, and maybe even answers. After all, what kind of man lives alone for decades in one of the most enigmatic and isolated forests in North America? I packed my things without thinking twice. A backpack, some supplies, tools, and I set off. The road seemed to get narrower and narrower, as if the urban world itself was fading away, pushing me into a territory that belonged to no one but nature itself. The road signs started to disappear. The houses vanished. My cell signal dropped. All that was left were trees. Trees and silence. But that silence wasn't just any silence. It was something deeper. It wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a strange, almost physical sensation, as if the very air there was different. Heavy, full of something I couldn't name, but made me wonder, why would someone choose to live there for so long and completely alone? When I arrived at the cabin, it was exactly as my childhood memory had recorded it, but now it seemed even more out of place in the world. An old structure, made of dark wood, weathered by time, with moss climbing the walls and a porch that looked like it was about to collapse. And yet, everything there seemed to be waiting for me. The door was locked, but the key was exactly where it was supposed to be, under a stone next to the door frame. That made me wonder, did he know that one day I would come? Was it a coincidence, or a kind of silent invitation? I walked in. The smell of old wood, dust, and something slightly metallic filled my nostrils. The cabin was intact. It didn't feel abandoned. It was as if my grandfather had gone out to get firewood and never came back. As I looked around that space, full of objects, old photos, worn tools, and furniture that seemed to hold more history than most living people, something inside me knew. This wasn't just a cabin. It never was. This was a piece of a much bigger puzzle. And the question that wouldn't leave my mind was simple but terrifying. What exactly was my grandfather doing here alone all these years? In the first few minutes inside that cabin, my brain was trying to process two conflicting sensations. On one hand, there was a strange familiarity, as if somehow I had always belonged to that place, even without ever living there. On the other, there was something that made me want to be anywhere else but there. But why? What exactly was causing me that unease so hard to explain? I ran my hand over the furniture, wiping away the accumulated dust. Every object seemed to have been placed there for a reason, like pieces carefully arranged on a board I still didn't understand. There were hunting tools, old maps pinned to the walls, boxes of ammunition, kerosene lanterns, and photographs. Lots of photographs, some so old that the paper was already starting to crumble at the edges. I approached one of the framed pictures. It showed my grandfather younger, holding something, maybe a rifle. Next to him, a hunting dog, and behind, the forest. But it wasn't a picture of celebration or pride. Their expressions were stiff, almost cold, almost as if posing for that photo was an obligation, not a moment of happiness. But where was my father? Why wasn't there any sign of him in any of those pictures? I opened one of the cabinets, hoping to find anything that could explain it to me. And I did, but not in the way I expected. Inside, organized in aged folders, were notes, lots of them. Some handwritten notebooks, loose sheets, almost obsessive records of something. They were lists, dates, points marked on maps, and in the middle of it all, newspaper clippings. News about missing people, all from the same region. Of course, at first, I tried to rationalize. Dangerous trails, wild animals, common accidents in such isolated areas. But as I flipped through each page, I realized the patterns didn't add up. It didn't make sense. Many disappearances happened under almost identical circumstances. Well-marked trails, favorable weather, groups of people that suddenly split up, and in the end, someone was never seen again. Coincidence? Or was there something more? As I organized those papers, I noticed a mark on the floor near the cabinet in the back. It was as if the floorboards were slightly misaligned, different from the others. I knelt down, and running my hand over it, I felt a gap. It was a small, almost imperceptible wooden lever embedded in the baseboard. I pulled it, and there it was, a small trapdoor in the floor, locked with a rusty padlock, old but still firm. That made me freeze. For a moment, I just stared at it. What does someone keep hidden in the floor of a cabin in the middle of nowhere? It was a simple question, but deep down, I was already beginning to fear the answer. Searching for the key suddenly became an almost automatic mission. I rummaged through every drawer, every box, every corner, but it wasn't there. At least, not at that moment. I tried not to give it too much importance. I convinced myself, or tried to convince myself, that it was something trivial. Something my grandfather kept for safety. Tools? Documents? Old weapons? Maybe. And deep down, maybe I wanted to believe that. After all, who wants to face the possibility that the truth is far worse than our minds can imagine? That night, I lit the fireplace, prepared some canned soup, and sat on the porch with a flashlight, staring at that sea of trees in front of me. And that's when I noticed a detail I had ignored until then. There was no sound. None. No insects. No owls. Not even the wind rustling through the leaves. Have you ever been in a forest in absolute silence? It's unnatural. And in that moment, a thought cut through my mind like a blade. Was I really alone there? And as if the universe wanted to answer me, it was that same night when I heard, for the first time, that sound. A sound that, to this day, echoes in my memory like a reminder I'll never be able to erase. The next morning seemed like any other, at least at first glance. Sunlight streamed through the windows in narrow beams, streaking across the cabin floor, as if the day itself wanted to remind me that life out there continued. Even though, inside that place, everything felt suspended in time. But deep down I knew, that lock on the floor, that thing hidden beneath my feet, wasn't just going to disappear. I spent hours searching everything. Every drawer, every box, even the pockets of old clothes stored in the closet. And it was only in the late afternoon, almost by accident, that I found it. At the bottom of a toolbox, wrapped in a thick piece of cloth, was the key. Small, rusty, with worn teeth. I held it in my hands, and for a few seconds, I just stared at it. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. The other part wished I had never found it. I took a deep breath, knelt down, placed the key in the padlock, and turned it. A dry snap echoed through the room as the latch popped open. I lifted the wooden hatch with some effort, revealing a narrow opening with an iron ladder descending into a dark, damp space, and one that was definitely not inviting. Have you ever had that physical sensation where your own body tries to stop you from doing something? As if your very biology is saying, "Don't do this"? That's exactly how I felt. I went down slowly, step by step. The first thing that hit me was the smell. A mix of wet wood, rust, mold, and something else. Something I couldn't quite define, but that instantly brought one word to my mind: old. Old in the deepest sense. In the sense of something that has been there for so long that it has, in a way, become part of that place. The room was small but completely filled. There were makeshift shelves packed with weapons. Rifles, knives, machetes, crossbows, ammunition. Some modern, others so old they looked like museum pieces. But they weren't trophies. They weren't there as decoration. They were there ready, as if, at any moment, they might be needed. And that wasn't all. There were also traps, of every kind you can imagine. Traps for animals? Yes. But also traps that clearly weren't made for any ordinary animal. Some were rustic, made of wood, nails, and steel wire. Others more elaborate, with mechanisms I couldn't even identify. But what exactly was my grandfather expecting to catch? Or who? In the corner of the room, pinned to the wall, were several maps of the region. All scribbled on, crossed out, with circles, notes, and dates. Some dates were very old, the 70s, the 80s, others more recent, as if this wasn't some old story, but something still ongoing. And at the center of it all, a huge map of the Appalachian Mountains covered in red markings. Next to the maps were dozens of newspaper clippings, all with similar headlines: "Hiker disappears on trail, body never found. Search ends with no results. Authorities blame animal attack." Always the same excuse. Always the same shallow explanations. But looking at that volume of cases, it was clear this wasn't a coincidence. And what would you think if you were in my place? Would you still believe it was just accidents? In the center of the basement was a table, and on it a dark, worn-out journal, its edges eaten away by moisture. It was my grandfather's journal. With trembling hands, I opened it. The first pages had seemingly mundane notes: weather, hunting observations, cabin maintenance. But as I flipped further, the entries changed. They became heavier, darker, and then there it was, a sentence heavily underlined, as if he wanted it to never be ignored. "It's not one. It was never just one. And the curse doesn't end when the sun goes down." Below it, almost like a desperate note: if only I had had the courage to tell my son the truth, maybe everything would be different. For a few seconds, I just stared at that sentence, feeling a knot tighten in my throat. Because in that moment, I understood. My father, he didn't abandon us. He didn't run away. He didn't leave. My father was taken, transformed, marked by something that lives or hides in these mountains. When I closed that journal, something inside me changed. It wasn't just fear. It was a different kind of understanding. That heavy feeling, that unease I'd been carrying since I arrived, finally made sense. And in a way, it felt like I had opened a door inside myself that I would never be able to close again. As if now, I was seeing what had always been there, hidden, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the old armchair in the living room, gripping my grandfather's shotgun, as if it could somehow keep anything away. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind against the windows made me hold my breath. And deep down, one question wouldn't leave me alone. Do they already know I'm here? At 3 in the morning, the answer came. And it didn't come in the form of a thought or a suspicion. It came as sound. First, footsteps. Not light footsteps. They were heavy, slow, as if something or someone was walking around the cabin, testing every wall, every crack, every boundary. I stood up slowly, flashlight in one hand and the shotgun in the other. I aimed the light at the front window, nothing. Turned to the side, nothing there either. But then I heard it. 3 solid knocks. 1, 2, 3. Just like that, on the back window. Knocks that didn't sound like someone wanting to come in. They sounded like someone letting me know they were already here. Can you imagine what it's like to hear that in the middle of a forest where there's supposed to be no one but you? I ran to the window and pulled back the curtain, but the flashlight only revealed shadows dancing among the tree trunks. And then I noticed it. 2 eyes, reflecting the light, fixed on me. They weren't animal eyes, and they weren't human either. They were something in between. The light hit them, and for a second I saw it. A huge silhouette, broad shoulders, bowed legs, a semi-upright posture, almost human, but it wasn't. Because no human creature has eyes like that. Instinctively, I stepped back, and the moment I took 2 steps away, I heard something heavy climbing onto the roof. The footsteps were clear, precise. 1, 2, 3, and then silence. A silence that wasn't natural, because it wasn't the silence of absence, it was the silence of waiting. It knew exactly where I was. But what was it waiting for? I turned off the flashlight for a few seconds, trying to control my breathing. My heart felt like it was going to rip out of my chest. And then something slid along the outer wall, as if claws were dragging across the wood, slowly, deliberately. And I asked myself, was that a threat, a warning, or an invitation? The following minutes were the longest of my life. Sometimes footsteps on the roof, other times creaks coming from the back. Then silence, a silence that was more violent than any sound. And in the middle of it, a deeply uncomfortable certainty began forming inside me. They weren't trying to come in, not yet. They were watching me, testing me, the way predators do with prey they don't yet understand. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves outside, I stepped out slowly. The porch was covered in marks, large, deep footprints, wider than any human footprint. And on the back walls of the cabin, the scratches, claw marks, some so deep they had cut through the wood almost all the way to the interior wall. Do you still think this could have been a bear? A coyote? Some random animal? Because I don't anymore. And as if that weren't enough, I found something that made my hands tremble. Right in front of the door, left there as if it were a gift. Or maybe a warning. A pile of stones, carefully stacked, forming a small tower. And on top, a black feather, perfectly balanced. Do you know what that means in ancient cultures? In the indigenous traditions of this region, it's not just symbolic. It's a marker, a territorial bunday, a clear message, you don't belong here. And that's when I understood something that completely changed my perception. They weren't coming. They were already here. They always have been. The following days were, without a doubt, the longest of my life. What had once been just discomfort, a feeling of being watched, had now transformed into a suffocating certainty. They were there. They had always been. And now they knew that I knew. Have you ever felt that? The difference between suspecting and being certain? Because once that line is crossed, there's no going back. I kept myself busy during the day, trying to pretend I had some control over the situation. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a fair fight. I cleaned weapons, set up traps, reinforced windows, doors, bolted the attic, the basement, even the ventilation outlets. Every hammer strike, every nail driven in was, in truth, a desperate attempt to hold back not only what was out there, but the terror growing inside me. And even surrounded by makeshift defenses, I couldn't ignore the signs. Because they continued. Always at dusk. Always the same way. Fresh footprints in the mud. Rocks stacked where there had been none the day before. Scratches on the walls. Footsteps on the roof. And that pattern of 3 knocks, always 3. As if it were some kind of code, a ritual, a reminder. But a reminder of what? It was on one of those early mornings that it happened. I was in the kitchen making coffee. Yes, as if coffee would solve anything, when I heard it. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't knocks. It was a voice. A hoarse, deep, raspy voice, but unmistakably a voice. Coming from the forest, from the shadows, from somewhere the light couldn't reach. And that voice said only 4 words. 4 words that still echo in my mind like a sentence. You know who I am. For a moment, everything stopped. The entire world seemed to hold its breath with me. I knew. Deep down, I had always known. I grabbed the flashlight, the shotgun, and went outside. And there he was, at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden among the trees. 8 feet tall, maybe more. Broad shoulders, semi-human posture, skin, or was it fur? Dark, thick, covering long arms, sharp claws. And even with that appearance, impossible to fully describe. I knew. It was him. My father. I didn't need him to say it. I didn't need an explanation. What stood before me wasn't just a monster. It wasn't simply a creature that nature had hidden. It was a consequence, a continuation of something much older. Something these forests have known since long before any road, any trail, any map. Something that survives our explanations, our beliefs, and our fears. And then he spoke again, but not in the way we speak. It was a mix of sound, guttural tones, something almost telepathic. Words formed more in my mind than in my ears. You are one of us. Your flesh is ours. Your bloodline belongs to the forest. And in that instant, everything made sense. The silence of the forest, my mother's fear, my grandfather's isolation, my father's absence. It was all part of the same equation, a cycle that had repeated itself for far, far longer than any of us would like to admit. He then reached out his hand, a deformed, hybrid hand, no longer fully human nor fully animal. And looking into my eyes, he said, "Accept, and you will never have to run again. Never have to hide. The hunger, the pain, the searching, it all ends. Here, now, with me, with ours." In that moment, time stopped. Because if you think the greatest fight is against fear, you're wrong. The greatest fight is against yourself. Against that part of you that wants to say yes. That wants to simply give up, surrender, stop fighting. And for 1 second, just one, I almost said yes. Almost. But I didn't. I couldn't. And then I did what my grandfather couldn't. I raised the gun, aimed at his chest, and with the special ammunition I had found in the basement, the one the journal said was the only thing capable of hurting them, I pulled the trigger. Not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but because I couldn't be part of this. I couldn't become the next piece in this cycle. The sound of the shot echoed through the valley. He staggered, looked at me not with anger, not with pain, but with something I still can't name. Something that seemed like sadness, or maybe acceptance. And then he fell. And the very second that happened, the sounds of the forest changed. Because they were there, all of them, hidden, watching, waiting. And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't a fight that ended. It wasn't a victory. It was just my choice. But the cycle that never ends. I returned to the city carrying a secret that could never truly be shared. Because tell me, how do you explain something like this? How do you look someone in the eye and say that there are things out there, things that logic, science, and maps simply cannot, or refuse to, explain? You don't. You learn to carry it. You learn to pretend everything is fine. That it's all in the past, even though you know the past doesn't always stay where it should. And if you think this is over, if you believe everything was resolved that night, you're wrong. Because the forests are still there. The trails are still being walked. The people, they still disappear. And those eyes, those shadows, that suffocating presence, it all still exists. Hidden, disguised, waiting, maybe, for the next person who, like me, decides to cross the line of what was meant to remain unknown. This story is just one piece. And someday, maybe you'll see the entire puzzle. If this made you think, don't forget to subscribe, like the video. It helps the channel grow. And share it. After all, more voices mean more discoveries.